Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another live stream where I have a very special guest with me, Tanner Linsley. Hi, Tanner.
Hello. It's awesome to be
How's,
here.
how's it going? Thank you for
It's going
joining
great.
us.
Yeah, you bet.
So you have been in our chats, and you have been a very popular, very widely requested, yeah, viewer, no, guest on the show. So there you are. Thank you for joining us, Tanner.
Yeah,
How's it
you bet.
going?
It's going great.
So, for those of you, I'm sure everybody in the chat knows you, but for those of you who don't know you or TanStack, do you want to give a quick introduction?
Sure. I'm Tanner. I've been building software for like 15 years. 10 of those years was doing a SaaS product called Nozzle.io. You can still go check it out. That's where a lot of the TanStack libraries were born because of the challenges of building that product. For 9 of those 10 years, I was the only front end developer and co-founder at Nozzle. So I had to do a lot of it on my own. So I outsourced to open source, you could say. Yeah, and then TanStack is the umbrella that I put all of those open source libraries under to make sure that it would live on beyond Nozzle. So
Yeah, and if somebody hasn't heard of TanStack, Router and Query are the two most popular products out of TanStack. Kind of like the default way of sending or like fetching data is the TanStack Query route. So if you haven't checked it out, definitely check out TanStack Query. But today we're going to talk about TanStack Start, which is in beta state. So let's talk about TanStack Start. As I understand, it is a Next.js alternative. But I want to hear from you. What do you think about TanStack Start? Where do you think it kind of fits in the picture today?
I would say it's part of the alternative to what's out there. So Start, I mean, we talk about TanStack Start as if it's the whole framework, but it's not. That's because we're used to talking about frameworks as kind of these monolithic things. So we say Next.js is the framework or the meta framework, or we say React Router now or Remix or whatever they're going to decide to call it later is the framework or Redwood or whatever, right? Gatsby. But in reality, these meta frameworks are built up of multiple pieces. And obviously, there's choices on how you put those pieces together. In the past, it's kind of been all in one type of thing, right? But even we're seeing now, even like with React Router, they have kind of a library and a framework mode now. And the framework mode is really just adding on some extra pieces that are needed to make it full stack. Next.js is more monolithic where, you can't use the Next.js router by itself without using all of Next.js. And the way that TanStack Start fits in is that it's actually quite a small piece when compared to TanStack Router. So most of the framework is just TanStack Router. And we've designed both of those pieces to kind of be very separate. So the router can be used without Start at all. It's just a client-side router that can turn into a server-side router when paired with Start. So Start is kind of the other side of the coin for the server utilities. So what Start is giving you that Router does not is it's giving you a server entry. So it's allowing you not just to have a client-side router, but it's giving you a server-side entry as well. Something that's like going to render this application to string, essentially. It's a little more complex than that because of streaming and whatnot.
Yeah.
The other thing that Start gives you is it gives you all of the server infrastructure. So API routes, server functions, all the things you need to kind of route web requests to the server and handle those on the server. And that includes, server routes, server functions, resource routes, whatever you want to call them. Essentially like an express, but specifically tailored for like a TanStack router application. And then the last thing that it gives you is it gives you all of the utilities you need to build and deploy using Vite. So it gives you a Vite plugin, and you have to feed that plugin to your Vite configuration. And then that tells Vite to build all the different environments. So one for your client, one for your server, and kind of makes all that work together.
Hmm.
So that's what Start is. And it's easier just to refer to it as, oh, it's TanStack Start, right?
Yeah.
But it's
it's
funny that
router
once you
plus.
get into, yes, yep.
Yeah.
Once you get into the code, you'll realize that a majority of your imports are just coming from TanStack Router.
Right. And do you imagine people would use Start as kind of like this place where they can kind of drop in other libraries, just like how React is? You have the React for rendering, but then you can use Redux for state management. Do you expect people to use Start that way? You have router, and then you have the server side streaming, but you can use some other libraries on top of Start.
Probably a little less so than our other libraries, mostly because a full stack framework doesn't really work without a router
Right.
that can act as the interface, the standard protocol for how things are going to be loaded both on the front and the back end. So I don't see a big use case for someone to say, oh, I want to use TanStack Start, but I'm going to use a different router. That would technically be feasible, but you would end up rebuilding a lot of things that we've already built. And I don't know, I just don't think that's going to happen. At that point, I would just say, well, why don't you want to use TanStack Router? And then we'll just make it better.
Yeah.
But as far as Start goes, we are building Start and Router to be framework agnostic. That was the plan from the very beginning, years and years ago when I announced, 3 years ago when I announced TanStack Router, I promised that it was going to be agnostic. I had to dial it back to just React so that we could get 1.0 out. But now that we're working on Start and getting kind of the full stack story together, we already have solid support for TanStack Router now. And we're very, very close on Angular support. And we're working on Vue and Svelte as well. And Start will be the same way. So Start is going to ship with solid support, which will be very confusing because we'll have solid Start from the solid team, and we'll have TanStack solid Start from the TanStack team. We're working together very closely with the solid Start team to share as many tools as we can. And it mostly comes down to solid Start has is a little bit of a different ideal on what it's going to be used for, and you could use it with different routers, that type of a thing. Whereas TanStack solid Start is going to be a TanStack router Start production.
Okay, I am so confused by all these words. Okay.
Sorry, it's a lot. But needless to say, we're working together with a lot of people to make sure that that the pieces that make sense to be used elsewhere can be.
Gotcha. Okay.
And are being used.
Gotcha. Okay, so I see Start as 95% router, and then maybe 2 or 3 files here, like SSR file, that just makes it on the server as well, and you've got router on the server. So basically, it's like router plus server-side streaming. Do you expect people to combine the Start? So Start currently doesn't ship with TanStack Query. You don't need to have TanStack Query right now, right? Do you expect people to use TanStack Query within Start? Do you think it's part of the framework? Is that how we kind of like package it?
I think it's very likely that a lot of projects will end up using Query, especially if they become or already are very client heavy and interactive. Mostly because if you have a client heavy app, things are interactive. I think you generally want Query, you want client side caching to get that really good user experience, to get that feeling of like kind of like it's a sync engine, but not fully, you're not buying into a sync engine just yet. And what's great is it doesn't mean that you have to pick from the very beginning and then just stick with it forever. The router has query-like features built into it already. So I took the very best pieces of TanStack Query and put them in router. So it has stale while revalidate caching on all of the loaders that you pass for all of your routes. You can invalidate all of those loaders. You can invalidate them one by one. You can set stale time and garbage collection times on all the data next to those loaders in each of your routes. You can do a lot of the same core things that you can do with Query right inside of routes. But there are some things you can't do, right? It doesn't have the pagination APIs. It doesn't have the retry logic. It doesn't have a lot of these like more advanced use cases. So if you're building a simple site that, you're just kind of grabbing content, bringing it in, you've got a couple of interactive things, but you're not sharing a bunch of data everywhere, then you'll probably be able to get away with TanStack Router just as it is. But if you start building a SaaS product or doing very involved things, naturally you'll want Query. So we made it that you can bring Query in later, and it makes sense. It's really easy to do. In fact, you just install it, put the Query client provider in there with a little plugin, and then you're done. You just start using it, and we take care of all the serialization for you and the hydration, and just make it as easy as possible. And then you can just start moving your data over to Query if you want.
Yeah, like I had an application where I was reading and writing to a file, and then the next point I had to actually fetch data from an API, and I ended up adding Query to it, and it was as simple as adding like a client and just calling the query using API. So pretty easy to plug it in even later on. I mean, given my application was simple at this point, but pretty easy to plug it later on as well.
And to give you an idea, so TanStack.com runs on Start and Router. And in the beginning, we didn't use Query at all because we were just kind of grabbing, Markdown from GitHub, different GitHub repos, transforming it, putting it right into the route loaders, and then just serializing it across the wire. But eventually, we wanted to do some more involved things. So one of them is like the convex counter that you see on the home screen with how many downloads there are. That uses convex, and convex uses TanStack Query. So when we put TanStack Query in there, it just worked, right? And then the other day, so I have been building an NPM stats dashboard. So I was actually just on it. But if you go to NPM, or if you go to tanstack.com/stats/NPM, you'll get a chart for NPM stats, and that's using TanStack Query. And I haven't wired it up yet because it hasn't been that important to me, and I don't necessarily need the chart to server render right now. But for all the other stuff, if I wanted to server render it, all I would need to do is tell that query to run on the server, and it would. So because convex was already in there, query was already in there. So when I wired up this chart with all the query stuff, you'll notice if you go and click on any of the other presets down below, you get the React query experience where navigating back between them and fetching different packages. If we've already done it once, it just loads instantly. So you kind of mix and match. You can decide, what do I want to use React Query for? And even beyond that, if you do just want to use React Query only on the client, you can still do that. But it works full stack. It will stream and hydrate and do all that fun stuff.
Right. There's a comment here that I want to highlight. Query is such an insane game changer. You'd be nuts not to use it.
One of the reasons for that, I think, is, some of it I planned, and some of it was just also, it just happened that way. But Query it has such a small surface area that it touches in your application that it is so portable. You can really put it almost anywhere, which makes it easy to use anywhere that you go. I mean, if you look at Next.js, even in Pages router and in the app router, people still insist on using Query. And it was so portable that it's been put into other technologies now too. So TRPC uses it, Convex is using it. We're seeing companies like Electric SQL is now writing adapters around it, and we're actually working with them on some new technology as well. So, yeah, I think it's difficult to beat the portability of Query. You know, it's definitely easier to use Query than it's like, hey, change your entire router. You know, Query is just like you drop it in and it works.
Yeah, and I think it's a standard we've become of like a calling API. And in my experience, it has a negative footprint. It removes code from code bases.
It does, yeah. That was the original reason that I built it, because I was using Redux to do a lot of what Query was doing.
Right.
So I wanted to write it to just remove all of that for me. So, I mean, that was by design.
Right. Actually, we talked about like Next.js, and a lot of the questions that have come up in the chat during live streams is that how does it compare to Next.js and Remix? So let's talk about that. Where do you see, like, what do you think are some of the advantages of TanStack Start as compared to Remix and Next.js? I know TanStack Start is client first, but let's talk about how it compares to those two frameworks.
Sure. So Next.js is heavily server first. So it assumes that everything you're writing, not only is it going to run on the server, just like Start assumes that everything you're writing is also going to run on the server, but Next assumes that what you're writing is generally a server component by default. So the components that you author, unless you render something that is used client, it's only going to run on the server. And that's that's cool. It's like a very PHP like old school mentality, you know, where it's like, oh, we're only going to run this on the server and just ship what we have to the client. And then if you want to do anything interactive on the client, you got to use client and kind of opt into that. So it's server first, opt in client, right? That comes, so that's kind of like the technical difference. I think a lot of the other differences mostly just come from like their opinions on API design, on how the router behaves, on how they handle, how do you define your routes, how do you compose things together. Also their APIs around things like data fetching and caching, and some of it is very core React, just like using async components, and then some of it is very like Next.js Vercel brand stuff. We like use cache, the use cache directive, right? So I think a lot of those API differences, when you get into the router itself, when you get into caching, when you get into some of the nuanced stuff about, you know, reading and writing things from the request and the response, a lot of that is just very proprietary to Next. So those are the biggest differences there. Moving on to Remix / React Router 7. It lives more in the middle ground, where it is also, all of the APIs I feel are authored to also be server first, but not in the same way that Next.js is, because Remix also just assumes that everything's going to be hydrated. So you're not, so all the components that you write and all the React code that you write, all of it's going to be client first as well. The only thing that they assume is server first, like Next, is all of their loaders, their data loading strategy, which is great. They strike a good middle ground where you can say, I can do a lot of things server first if I want. And that's mostly the default without really cornering you into server components. So that's, I think, where React Router 7 is really good. It's like, it is isomorphic, but you can do the server only stuff if you want. but it's still server centric. For instance, like if you were just to never ever use, if you were to never use a loader in Remix, but only use, well, no, that doesn't really make sense. You would have to use client loaders everywhere alongside your normal loaders with Remix to get an experience closer to TanStack Start. And so that's where Start differs from everything else, is that it's client first, meaning that it assumes not only all of the components that you write are going to run on the client. In fact, they will, because we don't have RSC support yet. And I think Remix just barely is starting to tease their actual RSC support. But we don't have RSC support yet. So all the components that you author are going to run on the client as well. It's fully hydrated. And then, but for the data loading and the authoring experience is very client side first as well. So it assumes that your loaders are going to run on the server, and then they're also going to run on the client on subsequent navigations. Now, those loaders, they can make calls back to the server to do server only logic. And that's where server functions come in to say, if you need something to only happen on the server, we want you to opt into that with TanStack Start. So when we say client first, that's really what we mean, is that just assume that everything's going to happen on the client unless you specifically say, this is something that I want to only run on the server. In fact, it's isomorphic. So assume that everything's going to run everywhere.
Yeah.
But if you want to isolate something to only the server, you need to use an API to do that. So for the logical parts of it, that's where we use server functions, which covers a lot of use cases, but not all of them, which is why in the future we're looking at server components to also handle the use cases where you say, I have a component that I only want to render on the server, and you opt into that to move that to the server only.
Okay, so if you want to only do server stuff, you said we can do API routes. Is that what the preferred route is for doing only server stuff?
You can use a server function or an API route, and the experience between those two is a little different. An API route is kind of your typical REST endpoint, where you say, this is the route. You don't have a lot of type safety because it needs to be very, very generic. It's just a request response. And if you needed it to be public, like an API route, but you also wanted type safety, that's when we would say you should use something like TRPC or Hano that would give you that public API, like the public API accessibility, but also allow you to bring types in where you want them. That's probably that's not my recommended path, because I don't believe a lot of full stack JavaScript apps are also supplying like an external API for people to use. I think it's more of like a back end for front end story. That's probably more likely, where either you're building an application and you just need to have full control over everything. You're not really exporting an API. So you can just use server functions to communicate back to the server, RPCs. Or if you're using an API already from like inside of your company or inside of your organization, which is very common, you would still use server functions to get back to your server layer of your application, and then just call those APIs from your backend team that's writing it in, Go, Elixir, or whatever. So server functions, I think, are probably the more preferred and more likely route, pun intended.
Right. Actually, let's talk about server functions. I think it's kind of like the way I see server functions, it's kind of like the meat of TanStack, except for the router stuff. TanStack Start. So let's talk about server functions. We've talked about it being isomorphic. Let's talk about like what happens when you write a server function. You run like / let's say homepage, and you have a server function. Let's talk about what happens, how the data flows from there.
Sure. So let's say we create a server function to fetch a list of to-dos. On the server, when we load our homepage for our to-do list app, our loader for our route is going to try and call that server function. And that might feel weird that you have to kind of do two of those things. You have a loader, but then you also have to call a server function from within inside it. But I'll explain why here in a moment. So when you create a server function, you do it outside of any of your other code. You just do it at the top level of your file and you say create server function. You don't need to give it a path or anything like that. You just need to give it, at the bare minimum, a function. And it will assume that you're using a post request, but you can customize it to use a get request as well. And when you give it this function, you don't need to deal with request and response if you don't want to. It will just assume that you're going to call it like a function with a typed arguments, and then you're going to return most likely JSON. You can return other things, but it assumes that you're going to return JSON. And that server function lives just up next to your code. It could live anywhere in another file, in the same file, and it has nothing to do with React. It's just a function that when we compile it, what we do is when we compile the server version of your application, the server version doesn't really make many changes. It just says, okay, we have this server function and we have the function that needs to run when it gets called. All it does on the server is creates a path under just like an opaque endpoint that we can call, and it registers to that endpoint. That's it. And then on the client, what happens is when we build the client version, the client bundle, we will take the code, like we'll take the function and all of the code inside of that server function, and we'll strip it out and remove it. And we also do dead code elimination. So if you strip out your function and you have imported things in your file like FS or Drizzle or something that is, server only stuff, then that will be dead code eliminated as well and be removed. So the client bundle shouldn't contain any logic that's actually going to run on the server. It just has a stub, like a little registration stub that says, this is a function, we know it exists on the server, and we have that opaque endpoint. Then, so now imagine what happens on the server in our loader when we call fetch to do or get to dos, right? From this, we just call the get to dos function we just created. It doesn't do anything special. It just says, oh, we need to call the function that's inside of here. And it calls it, you return the JSON, comes back, you have the JSON, great. And then we send the response down to the client, and the client hydrates, right?
And it's
then on the client, on the client, then we go navigating around, and eventually we come back to our home page. Then we need to fetch our list of to-dos again, but this time we're doing it from the client, not during like a server-side render. So the client loader will go to call get to-dos, but this time it's using that client version of the server function. And so instead of having the function, it says, oh, I know the endpoint to call, and I know all the things that I need to call. So it makes a fetch request to your server. And the server then says, oh, you want to call that server function that you had registered originally. And so it takes your request, routes it to that function, calls the function with all the logic that you had, gets the result, and sends it straight back to the client. So the client gets the same exact result, the same exact experience. The only difference is that we used an RPC architecture to make sure that it ran only on the server and then came back. It's really mechanically, it's not different than an API route or a REST endpoint. The difference is really just in the syntax and the automation around how it gets called. Instead of forcing you to create an endpoint and then on the server, you have to call like an inline fetch so that you're not making an extra network call to your own API on your own server. And then on the client, we're saving you from, well, now you've got to remember the endpoint and you have to handle the request and the response, and you have to handle all that stuff. we take care of all that for you. And then we layer in type safety, and we layer in a bunch of defaults. And that's really the gist of it, is that the logic is the same. You're just defining where the logic is running. And a server function, you're just saying, take this function and make sure it only runs on the server. And the function that it gives you back, the caller, will work the same whether you're in the server or the client. But we ensure that it runs only on the server. That's really all it is.
Nice. Okay, so we're with create server functions, we're ensuring that the data only runs on the server. And I think the second time you mentioned that when you go to fetch to-dos again, you register that the function is registered from the client side. So I didn't understand what happens after that.
So internally, we wrap up. Instead of having the function that we would call on the server, on the client, the only thing we can do is make a fetch request. So when you call that function, it is just making a fetch request to the server, running the function on the server and sending the result back to the client. And then we unwrap it the same way that we do on the server.
And that's because it knows that API route has been created by create server function.
Yeah. So in the client bundle, there's an actual endpoint, slash underscore server functions slash some weird hash or something like that. Yeah.
And I remember looking in the network request, and it looks like we're calling that API endpoint, and you can also see the data that comes back. But am I remembering correct that is not like JSON data, that is actually streamed data?
Sometimes. So that's in flux a little bit right now. We're keeping it an implementation detail because for server functions, since we control them 100%, we use serialization, a custom serialization layer. Now, it's very JSON-like, but what that means is that when we encounter values that can't normally be serialized, we can serialize those. So it is JSON compliant. You'll be able to inspect it in Chrome DevTools, and you see JSON. But for instance, a really simple one is you can send back undefined, which normally isn't possible. But we actually will serialize that, and then on the client we will deserialize that to show that it was an actual undefined. Or we can do things like maps and sets. We can also do promises, and promises are where you get into the streaming part, right? So we're moving to something called Laravel soon, which is what Solid Start uses. And we can already do streaming with SSR requests. So when you request an HTML document, we can stream anything that we want. But when you're just making a server function call, the streaming is a little different. So the way we do it today with a streaming call is that you would need to receive a readable stream. And that's possible today. We've seen if you've seen Jack Harrington do any of his streaming demos, you can return a readable stream right inside a server function, and then just write to that stream on the server function part, and on the client, it will receive those chunks as they come in. And he's done a lot of AI LLM token streaming that way. It's very cool. But if we want to do even more complex streaming of I guess we can do promises. I lied. So we can already do promises, and we can already do readable streams. So disregard the last minute of what I said. We're just making it better is really what we're doing. Laravel is just a better serializer in general. So we're going to be using that going forward.
Okay. So there's a question here, which is kind of a clarification of what we were talking about. Let's talk about this. Is server function related to the base route of the page? As Shruti asked, /home would automatically create and request /home/_server.
Currently, no. Currently, no. So for security-ish reasons, we're defaulting to try and obscure things as much as possible. So right now it will actually use a by default right now, it will actually use the file name of where the server function came from, and then an ID from within that file name to denote which server function it is, because you can have multiple server functions in a file.
Right.
Right now, that gets shipped to production. It's not that big of a deal, but we are going to default by 1.0. We're going to have the default be that we hash server function endpoints. So it'll be something more like /_ server function / and then we'll have a hash of how we identify, like a stable hash of how we identify that. There isn't really a big reason to make these server functions publicly accessible other than for debugging purposes. So yeah, I think for the most part, like in development mode, you will definitely see something more like what this question is implying. You'll see / to-dos / you'll see the route that it came from, and then you'll see the function ID. So you'll be able to know, oh, that's a request going out to that server function in development.
Yeah.
Just for security-ish sake, we'll obscure that at production by default.
Yeah. I was going to say, like, in development mode, we can show which endpoint it is, and then in production, we can make it a hash.
I think we probably need to talk about Vinxi, because I've seen a couple questions about that.
There's a lot of questions about Vinxi, and there was another one here that says, how far along is the DaVinci process for Start? And we've talked about the same word, DaVinci.
I know. So I mean, it's funny it's branded because that's what I've tried to do. All right. So Vinxi is a tool that was built by Nikhil Saraf, who he built Vinxi before the environment APIs for the latest version of Vite came out. So it was like being able to do environment specific things with Vite before it was even possible. And that's why Vinxi was amazing. That's what Solid Start used in the beginning and still uses today, is I'm pretty sure. And then what happened is Nikhil, he got a new job. He's very involved in it. He's building amazing things just in a completely different area now. And he just hasn't had time for Vinxi, which I totally understand. And at the same time, the environment APIs came out for Vite. And so it's starting to make some of Vinxi not necessary, some of it. And then not to mention Nitro is getting better as well, which Vinxi is based on Nitro as well. So we're kind of like unbundling Vinxi into its individual pieces so that we can maintain them a little bit better. And that's that process is what we're calling DaVinci. So it's basically just taking Vinxi apart and building any pieces that would be missing without simply just using Vite and Nitro directly. And we're basically done. I mean, we're talking about the last, quarter mile of the marathon here. We're talking about it right now in our Discord channel. Actually, I've got it open on my screen right now. There's just a couple of things left for file route. Actually, none of it's even related to the DaVinci process. They're just changes that we've made on the DaVinci branch that we just have a few last questions on. Things around path matching and some types. That's it. I think we'll be merging DaVinci hopefully with, my hope is that in the next day or two, but it could be a week or two, who knows. So
wow, that's pretty soon.
Yeah. And once we do that, there will be some breaking changes for anybody using beta. But they'll be minimal. So the difference is that like the API routes are changing. They're now just called server routes, and they're better and cooler. And then the other difference is that you're no longer going to use Vinxi as the CLI command to start and build your app. You'll just use Vite. And if you have used Start, you know that there is an app.config.js that kind of configures a little bit of Start. that just turns into vite.config.js, and that configuration goes inside our new plugin. So
Nice.
yeah,
Okay.
very, very small breaking changes, whereas everything else just pretty much stays the same.
Right. There's another question here, which is, when is V1 coming? TanStack Start V1.
Oh, my stretch goal was to have it out by like June 20th. So that's in 6 weeks, maybe a little less, 5 to 6 weeks. But I don't know if that's necessarily going to happen. I think it could be more realistic to see a release candidate by then. But the original plan was to have it out in early summer. So there's not really much holding us back at this point. We are future proofed for React server components. So when we want to add server components, we can.
Nice.
We have a bunch of things we want to do with router, but we've been holding off on breaking changes for router to get Start out. Yeah, I think the only other blocker would be we just need to go through and really work on documentation. One, we just need to finish the docs for Start because there's not a lot for Start there, which is fine. We just didn't want to write any documentation that we were going to ultimately change, and we just wanted to do it once and do it the right way. So we have to finish the docs for Start, and we'll probably do like a revamp of the router docs to make sure that everything is of the highest of quality that we can get out there.
Actually, speaking of docs, one of the things that I was wondering when I was writing the documentation for the reading and writing file is, what kind of things do you need to know in order to get started with TanStack Start? So let's talk about like prereqs.
Okay. Well, here's a fun one. So we're adding SPA support for TanStack Start. After Vinxi's done, it will basically be there. So you don't even need to know any like node or server APIs technically. If you just want to use Start to like build a static site generated SPA, you could still just keep it all on the client. So at that point, your prerequisites are going to be, you'll need to either know some of React or some of Solid. You'll need to learn TanStack Router and web APIs, I guess. I don't know. You'll need to know how to use your terminal. Hopefully you know how to use Git and one of the node package managers, hopefully something like pnpm or whatever. But other than that, I don't know what other prerequisites you would need. Everything's kind of already there. Now, when you start doing, JavaScript, TypeScript, hopefully. That's the thing is you can use TanStack Start and Router. You can use all of it with just JavaScript if you want. I don't know.
How about concepts like streaming, server-side rendering, hydration?
You might encounter a little bit of that, but I think that unless you knew what those were already, you're probably not going to reach for those patterns. And as long as you're not reaching for those patterns, then we handle all of that for you anyway. So like it streams by default. You don't need to worry about any of that. If you start using like promises across the wire, you'll need to know how to unwrap those on the client, but we have components to do that. You can use like React's use function, or you can use our await component. So not a whole lot there. If you want to use React Query, you'll need to know how to use Query. But again, we take care of all the streaming for you. So
I guess for debugging, it'll be helpful. And if you're already using streaming, that'd be helpful. But you don't need to know just to get started with it.
Yeah, just to get started, the idea is that you don't need very much at all.
There's a question here which I kind of want to ask. Kind of a niche question, but is CSP and more specifically none support something that's on the horizon?
CSP, remind me which one that is.
CSP. Content
No,
security
I know
policy.
nonce is
Content security policy.
content security policy. Something that's on the horizon? Yes, absolutely. I know we've had people ask about nonce support and whatnot, and we'd be happy to add that as soon as possible. I know Remix is just barely like solidifying some of their nonce APIs, but yes, like that is definitely on the horizon. It hasn't been a priority yet, but it is on the list because its security is obviously a high priority. I'm just waiting, for whatever that team is to come out and say, "Hey, we found a security vulnerability in TanStack Start." And I wouldn't be surprised, to be honest, with how new we are. But the hope is that we can avoid a lot of that stuff. We have been very careful with the way that we communicate between the server and client in general. We've tried to not abuse headers and not abuse weird isms across the wire with how we transfer data. That is kind of the nice thing about being a client side first, is that we're really following pretty much all the same rules that everyone's been following for the last 10 years anyway. It's just a client-side application making fetch calls to the server. Hopefully, crossing our fingers. I mean, I would expect there to be some security things found and fixed pretty early on, especially once we announce a release candidate. I might even reach out to that team who has been finding the security vulnerabilities for Next and Remix and say, "Hey, we're in release candidate. I would love for you guys to just brute force this and see what you can find."
That brings me to a question, like what kind of applications do you think would not be a right fit for TanStack Start?
That's a hard question because you could look at any framework and probably shoehorn any use case into it. You could have a really, really dynamic client-side heavy application, write it in Next.js, and it will work. And similarly, TanStack.com is a very static server-side site where we're mostly just serving documentation, but it works great for TanStack Start. So, I would say if you're just trying to produce really, really static content and using a front-end framework isn't really a choice for you, then it's like you should be looking at something like Astro. If React server components are like ride or die for you, then you should probably be using Next.js for now. When Remix and TanStack Start come out with React server components, I don't think that will be an issue anymore. If you are building a React application, like you're using React for a good reason on the front end, rather other than just templating, but you're actually using it to manage state and conditional rendering, and you have a highly interactive application on the front end. At that point, I just don't understand why you wouldn't want the best in class for like a highly interactive site or even a moderately interactive site. Because even with moderate interactivity, you're going to probably have client-side data fetching. You're going to need caching. You're going to need state management that's type safe, which falls back to TanStack Query or doing it in the URL. And if you're doing any state management in the URL, I don't know why you wouldn't want to use TanStack Router. I guess you could use Nux if you wanted, but I don't think there's a use case that like once you get into that threshold of like really any decently sized client-side interactivity that I wouldn't say TanStack Router is going to be a great fit.
One of the examples that's coming to my mind is, and I don't know if this will be a good fit for TanStack Start, is an application that has a lot of interactivity all baked in with Redux. And there's a lot of like data in the store, and it's very client-side heavy. So not a lot of like communication with the server, but a lot of dependence on Redux. Do you think that is an application that is worth moving to TanStack Start?
Absolutely, because Redux is all client side anyway, really. So at that point, I guess the question in your mind would be, unless you know for certain that, you don't need a router.
Yeah.
And you don't really care about the ability to do anything on the server. No server functions, no API routes. You don't want anything to do with server code at all. And you don't need a router. Sure, drop Vite and React and Redux and you're good to go. But I don't know of a project out there that couldn't use a router.
Yeah.
That shouldn't use a router. Even if you only have one page in your whole application, it's still a page. And it's very uncommon, I think, at that point to say, oh yeah, here, so I published this to the internet. Here's my application. You can go use it. But no matter what URL you put in there, you're always going to land on the same starting point.
Yeah.
I don't imagine that. Even if you needed to just be able to, as soon as you put that out on the internet, as soon as you do anything worthwhile as a business, you're going to need a terms and conditions page, and you're going to need, you're going to need a privacy policy page. And it's like every tool is going to ask you, what's the URL for your terms and conditions and your privacy policy page? It's like, oh, I can't give you that URL because even if you put /privacy in there, you're not going to see it, So it's like, I don't understand why you would never need a router. So if you're forced to make a decision on a router, I don't know why you wouldn't just use TanStack router at this point, because then it's a fluid story. And I mean, that's the case even for React router. That's what they're giving you to, right? It's like, if you're going to choose a router, you need to choose one that's going to gradually allow you to safely and fluidly grow into a higher plane of responsibility without having to upend your entire application. And that's the same story here. They do a good job of that. We do a good job of that. My selling point is that if you're going to use a router, you might as well use the best one. And I believe TanStack router is the best client-side router out there right now.
There you go. Yeah. Okay.
And it's just going to get better because Start's taken up 2.5 years of my life now for the last 2.5 years. And I mean, when Start's done, we're going to keep going with Start. But I was only on like the first evolution of router. Like we have way more plans, way more cool things planned for just the router, like the core router that we haven't even touched yet. And I'm really excited to get back to those.
I'm excited to see it.
Yeah.
There's a question here, which is, I think this is a really great question, especially like people coming from not just Next.js. So the question is, what would you tell someone coming from Next.js? And I think this is a good question because what if you're coming to TanStack Start from a non-framework, like you just have a React library, but also from like a really big, heavy, opinionated framework like Next.js or even Remix? What would you tell them?
Well, let's start with the non-framework first. If you're coming to TanStack Start from like no framework, I guess starting at the baseline, you'll be adding a router. And that's not that hard. It's like, if you want to use file-based routing, it's like one file, two files with like minimum boilerplate. And then you can just wrap your original component and then you just keep going and you're done. If you're moving from React router, we share a lot of the same concepts that React router has. The syntax changes a little bit in some places for like better type safety so that it's all inferred. And some things are different, but we have conceptual equivalence. So moving from React router is not a big deal. In fact, I've done that several times. I had to do that for TanStack router for TanStack.com because I was using Remix for TanStack.com for a while. And it was using Next.js before that. Moving from Next.js to TanStack Start and router will probably be the biggest lift. But again, it's not that bad. To give you an example, I had a branch of Theo's T3 chat. It's T3 chat, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I had taken a version of his Next.js repo and migrated it to TanStack Start. And it took some work, mostly around just if you heavily rely on server components, like because that's the default for Next.js, you might run into situations where you didn't expect this component to only render on the server. Now you have to render it all the time on the client. You have to hydrate it all the time. That's just first of all, it was a really big hurdle for people who had already been in the React ecosystem to get there in the first place, to be like, what? Use client, use server, you split, right?
Yeah.
For people who are used to that and Next, now coming back and saying, oh, all of your stuff's going to be hydrated again. It's still a change. I think some of it is actually a relief because now you don't have to be splitting components into multiple files all the time, which kind of just becomes this habitual thing that you do with Next.js now, where you're like, okay, I've got this component, but I have to split it into two pieces because some of it needs to run on the server, some of it needs to run on the client, you don't need to do that anymore, but you still have to consolidate the mental stuff back together. And that's more of the work that needs to be done moving back from Next. That said, I see a lot of Next.js projects where they've got one or two components high up that are server function or server components. And then everything from there down is basically client, right? Basically at route at route boundaries, they have their server components, and then everything down is mostly client. That mostly matches up with the way that TanStack Start works as well. At the route boundaries, you have server logic for your data fetching and doing things only on the server. And then everything from there down is just kind of like writing a regular SPA React application. So there's a little bit more work to do with Next.js, but in the grand scheme of things, it is really not that big of a lift. It's not like you're changing frameworks, from React to Svelte. It's all still React. You move your components over, and for the most part, everything is going to work exactly the same. Most of it comes down to just how you're organizing your routes, where you're putting your data fetching logic that should only happen on the server. Once you get past that hurdle, everything feels pretty much the same.
So would you say like the stuff that you would put in use server in Next.js, you put that in create server function now?
Yeah, and that's where React server components could feel like the lack of them could feel intimidating for somebody coming from Next.js. But really, there's very, very few use cases, in my opinion, where server functions are actually the right tool to reach for. Next.js just defaults to them for a lot of stuff. But I don't know, for me, so like a good use case is like, in fact, I just saw one on the internet from, I think it was Wes Boss. He was like, hey, or no, maybe it wasn't Wes. I saw it on the internet. I don't know where, but they fetched a CSV from somewhere, and then they used Papa Parse, right, to parse that CSV. Papa Parse is a big library. And if you fetch that CSV on the client and then parse it on the client, you've got to ship Papa Parse to the client.
Right.
That's a big bundle. That's a big thing to put on the client, right? Now, if that's the use case, imagine that's your problem that you have right now, okay? Oh man, I've got Papa Parse in my client bundle, and it's really, really big, and I hate that. How can we solve that? Well, let's not forget that for the last really, really long time, we've already been able to code split and lazy load things. I don't know why people forget this, but you could put that Papa Parse behind an asynchronous import and say, hey, only when we get to this page, or only when we render this component, or only when we do this thing. In fact, you could use React Query to do it. You could say, hey, React Query, asynchronous function, go fetch this CSV and fetch pop a parse, the import, the dynamic import, fetch that part of the bundle, bring them together, parse the CSV. Yes, you've got to bring it into the client, but at least it's not in your main bundle. And from my perspective, that's probably going to solve a lot of people's problems.
Yeah, that's still way better.
But maybe it doesn't. And you're like, I don't want to ship pop a parse to the client at all. Like I want to go to the server and do it there. Well, that's where then you have the ability to use a server function and say, okay, I'm going to do all the logic on the server. So I'll go to the server in a server function, say, fetch me the CSV from here, bring in pop a parse from here, parse it, whatever, and then send me back the JSON, right? And then you get the JSON on the front end and you marry the JSON and the JSX together and you render. That probably solves another huge chunk of the problem where it's just like, I can't run this thing on the client. I can only run on the server. So there you go. You do it there, which leaves a very small sliver, in my opinion, of parts where you say, you know what? I don't even want to ship that JSON to the client at all. I don't even want to do that. All I want is the markup. So like, let's say, because maybe that JSON is really, really, really big, but the markup that it produces is this small. And so if that's the case, that's where server component finally makes a lot of sense to say, okay, I just want to do all of it on the server. So go get me the markup, right? And so you make a request to the server, or you're already on the server and you say, fetch the CSV, grab pop-up parse, get the JSON, render it out to some markup, and then that's what I get, right? This hopefully small piece of markup, right? It's exhausting to go through that like escalation level, but in my opinion, that is where React Server components shine. So unless, I mean, and there's a couple of other areas, but that's mostly it, right? Dynamically generating markup and having the markup be the only thing that you send. That's it. And being able to dynamically do that with like not doing a bunch of weird bundling things, right? That's where it really shines. And so unless you're in that camp, moving from Next.js to TanStack Start or even Remix and like losing server functions, you probably won't even notice. In fact, the only thing you'll notice is that you don't need to split your files apart anymore, or you just keep them all together, and that you don't need to use client and use server everywhere. You know, that'll be the biggest change. And if you are in that sliver of use case that makes a lot of sense, then you'll just have to either get by using JSON and then doing your templating on the client, like that's the other part of it that I suggested. Or you'll just have to wait for a little while longer until we support React Server components.
Yeah, I was going to ask next, like right now, TanStack Start doesn't support React Server components, right?
Adam had a comment that I love, the very last one there.
G's of compression shrinks the sliver even smaller, Yeah,
if you're just shipping JSON, yes, it's like, and see, there's other considerations too, where if you're constantly going back to the server for every single interaction, and then that's producing a ton of HTML output, where only a small portion of that HTML output has actually changed from render to render, it probably would have been more efficient over the lifetime of your user session to just fetch the thing for the thing that changed and just update that one piece. So there's considerations between what is the nature of your app? What is the nature of your users and their session like? Are they going to the server, one time and bringing back a big chunk of HTML that never, ever, ever changes or rarely changes? Server components would be a great fit. Honestly, tanstack.com. What is it? You request a page. This is most of tanstack.com's functionality for the documentation. You request a page, you get back a hunk of HTML that rarely changes. Server components will be amazing for tanstack.com. They will. but just because we don't have them right now doesn't mean it's a big deal, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but other than that, like for interactive stuff, or basically for everything except for static content that's rarely changing, I won't miss RSCs that much.
Yeah.
There's other considerations around like AI, like LLM generation. Like, can we generate markup that's like dynamic bundles from things? We might get more into that in the years to come, but right now it's not a massive deal. I know that's what V0 does essentially. But I don't know, unless you're V0, I don't see why that's a huge deal.
Right. There's some questions around auth. How do you manage auth state cleanly with Next.auth, like handling token expiry redirects and auto refresh on the front end? And I love the comment after this as well. Just don't use Next.auth. It changes erratically more than my ex.
I've never used Next.auth. I hear it was pretty good. So we have a partnership with Clerk, which really just means we've helped them build a really good integration for TanStack Start. But the reality is that TanStack Start still just operates on primitives of request and response. And we can also do client-side centric stuff too. So for really any auth provider, there's no reason that it wouldn't work with TanStack Start. We have Clerk integration, which is great. There's also great support for better auth out there. I saw somebody do a Firebase auth. And there's different considerations inside there too, where you can say, where do you want to do your auth? Do you need to do it server side before you render any content at all? Or do you want to do it client side and basically render the shell on the server, but only auth on the client? So lots of considerations there. But how do we manage it cleanly? I just saw a Twitter comment actually that I really liked, and I'm going to go find it because it was that good. Let's see, before load. Here we go. This was a fun one. I'm going to share it inside of the chat. Comment has failed to post.
Maybe put it in the
I'm going to give it to Shruti, and she can post it. But just a little comment, and I'll read through it. It says somebody was giving notes on TanStack Start, and it said, in the second point, authentication is so simple. Before load in root and a before load in auth parent root is all I need. So we have these hooks inside of your route configurations called before load, and they're hierarchical. So unlike React Router and Remix, which treated all route loaders kind of as always parallel, we have two phases. So we have a serial execution layer that happens in before load. So before we load any routes, we run through each route's before load to make sure that it's going to pass all of the conditions. And then if that passes, then we kick off all the parallel loaders themselves. So what that means is that if you have an entire branch of your application that needs to be protected by auth, you can just go to the very root node of wherever that branch is. And in the before load hook, you just check to see, is this person auth? And you can do that either by calling a server function that checks a server-side only cookie or some server-side only session. Or you could do it from the client and check a client cookie, or you could check a token, or you could use some auth provider that primarily functions on the client and check that they're logged in. And if they're not, you throw a redirect to whatever your login screen is. Or if you don't want to throw a redirect, you can just do it in your render if you wanted, I guess. You could just not render that content if you don't want to redirect. So, I think pros and cons, it's very flexible. It's request response, so it's going to support a lot of different things. I don't think it should be a problem for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think that sounds pretty simple to set up.
What was that?
I think that sounds pretty simple to set up, like with the before load function.
The problem is that there's choices, right? Because of the flexible nature of it, there's choices to make.
Yeah.
For instance, there's a lot of applications that it's like, it never really makes sense to like, in my opinion, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to server render like authenticated data, authenticated user pages, I guess, because one, you probably shouldn't be indexing those anyway.
Yeah.
No robot is going to be able to get through that authentication anyway. So at that point, if you're server-side rendering, it's really just for performance. So there is a use case to like server-side render down to a certain point. But once you hit an authentication point, unless you're like doing a server component or a server function somewhere, you could say that it might not be worth it to run your authentication until you get to the client anyway, to just say, hey, you know what, we don't know if they're authenticated, so we're just going to do dynamic rendering from here down. That is a use case. I'm not saying that's the way you should do it, but that is a use case. And that's something that I'm excited about too, because that leans into hybrid static and hybrid dynamic rendering. So it's kind of like SPA mode, but for specific route segments. So what you can do is you can say, you request a page that's like slash, I don't know how to come up with a good example for this, but let's say in some nested component, you have authenticated only data, right? You could technically server render everything around it. So it goes to the server and it renders, all the stuff around this, and then it gets to the authenticated component or something that you only need to do on the client. And then you can just say, this is client only. Either this whole route, or just this component is client only. And then it ships to its server renders, and there's just kind of like an empty space there, or even like a fallback of like it's loading. And then when it gets to the client, it mounts and does its thing. So there's a lot of flexibility in like where you want the server rendering to start and stop, so to speak. There's even a way that I'm working on to where you can do static shell export. So you'll like old school static site generation. You static render all of your pages, all of them that you can. And then for the dynamic ones, it will fall back to a shell that is basically empty with a loader. And then when that loads, it's like, oh, we weren't able to pre-render everything here, but when it mounts, you get this SPA-like thing, and you can still call back to server functions because you're running a server.
Is that using suspense query?
No, that's just using router. So.
Oh, huh. You can do that right now with router. You can have like shell-based routing.
If you were just using TanStack router, yeah, absolutely. It's just like an SPA. But it's the pre-rendering part of it that gets complex, because right now, if you were just using TanStack router and not Start, you'd basically just have an index.html file and then reroute every request to that index.html file. And you're back to kind of SPA. But now you don't have server functions unless you stand up an API server somewhere, right? And you don't have pre-rendering, because to do pre-rendering, you kind of need, like to do static site generation, you kind of need a server-side framework that can at least run in your CLI, right? Yeah. So by adding Start, you get both of those. You get server functions that you can stand up on a server if you want, and you get a server framework that can at the very least run in CI to statically generate your site. And the hard thing happens is if you just want to funnel everything to an index.html, that's easy to do. But what if you want to do both? What if you want to static pre-render a bunch of pages, including your homepage, which is index.html, but then have some pages fall back to a shell? You wouldn't want those dynamic pages falling back to your homepage that you pre-rendered. because then your homepage content would like be there and then it would disappear and then you re-render with the right content. So we're creating like a shell mode where you can say, I want to pre-render everything that I give you, but for dynamic pages that aren't in that list, I want to have it fall back to a shell that has only been statically rendered up to a certain point, and then we'll inject all of our dynamic content inside of it. It's a lot, but
how is that different from how we do suspense query? Because with suspense query, you can have fallback components, and then you just put data in whenever it loads in.
The difference with what I'm describing is that suspense query assumes that there's a server involved. So with this setup, with the pre-rendered setup and the fallback, we're assuming that it's all client side.
Oh, that's cool.
That any server side generated stuff is done at CI time, and that the server does no server side rendering while it's live. The only thing the server is doing is just doing API calls for server functions or API routes. So it's SSR less. All of the SSR happens at build time.
Oh, that is really cool. Okay,
so it's somewhere between a static site generator and having a server for your server functions and your API routes. So it's like both. You get static site generation to handle all your SSR, but then you're done with your SSR and you ship your server still, but your requests to the server are not doing any SSR. It's only for server functions. Hopefully you would hit the CDN for all of your pre-rendered pages. And for any that weren't pre-rendered, it renders the shell, and the shell can then hit your server functions or API routes.
The shell approach is addressing a sliver of the sliver. I just go fully isomorphic at that point.
Totally. I'm with you. I don't think that setup itself is a super big use case, but the ability to opt in on either side, those are the use cases that we want. It just so happens that you can do them both at the same time. So the ability to have a fully dynamic server, but do pre-rendering, that's the part where it's like, okay, yeah, I'm shipping my server. I can do all my SSR on the server, but I'm going to pre-render some of these pages for speed. And then the other side of the coin where it's like, I don't want to do anything on the server at all. I don't want any pre-rendering. I don't want server functions. But you do want a static site generation. So a lot of it is with that like pre-rendering static site capability that you can mix and match with a couple of other things.
There's one more question here which I want to highlight. What was the most difficult thing in building TanStack?
Well, TanStack is huge. Which part are you talking about?
TanStack Start.
Start? All the Vinxi stuff, even early on, just figuring out how it all works together, getting a grasp on Babel. Like I had to write a bunch of custom Babel plugins to like rip code apart and do dead code elimination, and getting a handle on Vite and how Vite works, and then just getting all the bundling strategies right. So like building that part of it, like bundlers are hard, AST transformations are hard. The rest of it was the fun part, and it was still hard, but it was fun, so it feels easier. So I think those were probably the hardest, and still are the hardest parts for us. And obviously the hardest part of the router was just figuring out how to do type safety. So.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but that was like years ago that we kind of had that figured out. But type safety is hard to like architect something from the ground up to say it's got to be fully type safe and fully inferred. So like, how can we have it 100% type safe, but not write any TypeScript types, basically as much as possible? That's really, really difficult.
Okay, one final question for you before we wrap this up is, from the documentation, there is a few different ways of getting started with TanStack Start. You can have like manual config, like you can manually set up a few files, or you can use a starter app. How would you recommend people start with TanStack Start?
I'd say it depends on how long you're going to stick around. No, I think that it's probably best just to use a starter and just get going quickly and feel productive and feel a good win. Get a good win under your belt and a rush of adrenaline to say like, oh yeah, this is cool. I want to keep going. But I think it would be smart regardless to then go back and say, okay, now that you have, now that you've tasted the Kool-Aid, let's go back and show you how it's made. So you can understand a little bit better about why we made some of the choices that we did. So I would say both, but just in that order.
Yeah. And the starter comes already with API routes and server functions. So it's a really good starting point anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Somebody asked why I look younger. I've dropped like 47 pounds.
Damn. Do you want to give us tips on losing weight?
Just eat better. In my case, it was just eat less because I was just addicted to food. So eat less, exercise more. I'm running a lot now. I'm training for a half marathon with my wife, which is fun.
Oh wow.
Yeah, just it's going to be different for everybody, but for me, it was just eat less and pay more attention to what I'm doing.
We need another live streaming from Tanner.
Live streaming X. Yeah, it's hard. So you've got to understand that. I mean, I just barely got doors on my office, but I have 3 small children who love me dearly and know that I work from home. And I have a wife who loves me probably even more, who also knows that I'm just an arm's length away. So it's very rare that I get a time where I can just actually like, put the red recording light out on the door, so to speak, and say, don't bother me at all. I'm recording. I barely get away with like these live streams right now. Like right now, the family's not at home, so it's whatever. But when my door's shut, everybody really misses Dad. So
it's when the door's shut that people want in.
exactly. And when it's not shut, they're just wandering in here. I've got all the fun stuff in here. I've got the 3D printer. I've got all the art supplies in my office. So yeah, my office is the gateway to fun. Or it's just, they just want me to sit. My daughter came in yesterday and she said, Dad, can you just stop working and come play with me? You know how hard that is to resist?
I know. That's so sweet.
Luckily, the nature of my work now is that if I want to do that, I can. And sometimes I do. And it's great. So,
yeah. Well, we definitely appreciate your time, Tanner. Thank you so much for joining us. Not just on this live stream, but also for all the work you're doing around TanStack. I think it is amazing for the community, and you're doing great stuff. Thank you for doing it.
I appreciate it. I really love doing it. DevTools has become my home, and I don't really plan on leaving anytime soon. So I really love it, and I'm glad that everybody likes it as much as I do. So
we love having you here. Thanks, Tanner. Thanks everyone for joining today. We are going to see you offline. Bye, folks.